Vietnam has long sustained a tradition of religious tolerance. Religions of different origins coexisted peacefully throughout the history of national struggle for independence and freedom. With the introduction of Catholicism as early as in the 16th century, there was an interruption due to the association of some Catholic communities with the French colonization of Vietnam in the late 19th century. Upon declaration of independence in 1945, President Ho Chi Minh solemnly affirmed religious freedom, eventually eliminating the divide created by foreign interference. Religious freedom, since then, has been enshrined in all constitutions of Vietnam, both in time of war and peace. Today, Vietnam has more than 25 million followers of 6 main religions, namely Buddhism, Catholicism, Protestantism, Cao Daism, Hoa and Islamism. Plus, tens of millions more are practicing traditional beliefs and cults, thus further enriching the long tradition of religious tolerance and freedom.
Hello there, this is Talk Vietnam. You've just seen some snapshots of the religious development here in the country. Now, religions vary from country to country, and so do the views and opinions on religious freedom. Now, today we have a special guest from the United States. He'll share with us his views and thoughts on religious freedom here in Vietnam. He is Dr. Chris Seipel. He is the president of the International Institute of Global Engagement, and commonly known as IGE. And Dr. Seipel has frequently traveled to Vietnam. He's talked to many governmental as well as religious leaders. So he's here today with us to share his stories. He also twice testified before the U.S. Congress on the issue of religious freedom here in Vietnam. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Seipel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you for taking the time for coming on to the show. So how many times have you been to Vietnam?
This is the 8th trip.
The 8th trip. So what keeps you coming back?
Well, the food, for starters, but also the people. The people are the most gracious and hospitable people I've met on the face of the planet. And we also have some common interests to talk about between our two countries, including religious freedom, and we find ways to partner together to ensure that good progress is made.
How did you get started on the subject of Vietnam?
Well, it depends on where you want to start in the story. My father fought here during the war, and so it's a part of our family history. It was the Ministry of Reconciliation was very important to my father, and he wanted to work here once we started the Institute for Global Engagement in 2000. And the time was not right, but later on we did begin to work here in 2005, and we've been able to work with several Vietnamese agencies of the government to discuss and develop practical programs that promote religious freedom here in Vietnam.
Now we'll move on to the main subject now, religious freedom. In 2004, the United States designated Vietnam as a country of particular concern, more commonly known as CPC. How did this designation come to be?
Well, CPC, if you want to be technical, is a legal definition by a law that was created by our Congress in 1998. It means there's systematic, egregious, and ongoing violations of religious freedom within a country. And if the Congress or if the President designates a country of particular concern as such, then there's a menu of sanctions that the President can take against that country and that the State Department then implements.
Now, before this designation is made, does the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, does it request the countries in question to address its concern?
There's an interesting balance. There's the State Department, which is tasked with writing an International Religious Freedom Report and makes the recommendation to our Secretary of State and through him or her to the President about that. At the same time the law was created, an ambassador was created as well, that was my father, and then there's also an independent watchdog of sorts to watch the government and see if they're doing the right thing. So the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom sometimes makes recommendations that are different from the State Department. And so there's a healthy tension, which is, of course, the way our system of government was set up to have checks and balances.
to have a checks and balances before they bring out the final designation.
Yes.
And now at your testimony before the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, this was on July 12, 2006, you advocated the lifting of the CPC designation for Vietnam. You said, I quote, "I believe that the United States should honor Vietnam's good faith effort in religious freedom, lift CPC, and then establish PNTR, which is Permanent Normal Trade Relations." So can you tell us what led you to making this testimony?
Sure, it's a great question. In America, sometimes different issues overseas are painted as black and white, very simplified, especially that's the nature of politics and the nature of Washington, but any capital in the world. And Vietnam was being portrayed as this black, oppressive, communist state, and where there had been systematic, egregious, and violations of religious freedom. I came over here at the suggestion of the Vietnamese embassy to see what was actually taking place in some of the provinces, Gia Lai in particular, and found that there was actually quite a different view of a different reality taking place on the ground than was being portrayed in Washington. So I simply told that story, but I also told the story of the geopolitical context of the bilateral relationship. So if they're making a good faith, Vietnam, then we want to honor that approach and say values are more important than interest. But if they're going to honor those values because they're common to both of our countries, then we should honor interest, which is normal trade relations, which in turn enables the ascension to WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is very important to Vietnam to have lower tariffs for their exports and therefore more jobs for a youth population that has been, half of which has been born since 1975.
In support of this PNTR status in early December 2007, you once again testified, and this time in front of the U.S. House of Representatives. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's a tough thing to continue to get the same message across, that we don't have to punish people every time and react to a situation, but that we can work with those who are taking small and ongoing steps, and we should celebrate that and promote it and say we can work with this government and this people, and let's try to do that in good faith. And that's been the process since 2006 and 2007.
Right. Now, before we continue talking about your experience here in the country, we'll take a look at some footages of the current development of religion here in Vietnam. Take a look.
Religious freedom in Vietnam is recognized by the Constitution 1992 as stated in Article 70 as follows. The citizen shall enjoy freedom of belief and of religion. He may or may not follow a religion. All religions are equal before the law. The places of worship of all faiths and religions are protected by the law. No one can violate freedom of belief and of religion, nor can anyone misuse beliefs and religions to contravene the law and state policies.
Ở Việt Nam có khoảng 25 triệu tín đồ. Trong đó thì Phật giáo là có 12 triệu, Công giáo là có 5,2 triệu, Tin lành thì có khoảng 1 triệu, rồi đến các cái tôn giáo như là Cao Đài, rồi Hòa Hảo và các cái tôn giáo khác. Giáo hội Phật giáo Việt Nam sau 20 năm thì cái số lượng cơ sở thờ tự đã tăng lên gấp đôi so với trước đổi mới. Thế còn về phía Công giáo đấy, nếu có dịp chúng ta đến cái vùng đạo ở Nam Định, Ninh Bình thì chúng ta thấy rằng là xứ nào cũng có nhà thờ và rất nhiều các cái họ đạo đã có nhà nguyện. Và đây thì bà con đã dùng một cái hình ảnh mà tôi cho là rất thú vị, tức là cái bóng của cái tháp chuông nhà thờ này đổ vào cái tháp chuông nhà thờ kia.
The primary religions of Vietnam are Buddhism and Christianity, which includes Catholicism and Protestantism. Mahayana Buddhism, also known as Northern Buddhism, the Greater Will School or the Greater Vehicle School, is a predominant religion in Vietnam. Catholicism was introduced to Vietnam in the 16th century. At present, the most densely populated Catholic areas are Bu Chu, Phat Diep in the northern province of Ninh Bình and Hồ Nai Biên Hòa in Dong Nai province to the south. Protestantism was introduced to Vietnam 100 years ago. That is the fastest growing religion in the country. At present, most Protestants live in the Central Highlands. Cao Daiism was first introduced in 1926. Settlements of the Cao Dai followers in South Vietnam are located near the church in Tây Ninh. The number of followers of this sect is estimated at 2 million. Hoa Haoism was first introduced in 1939. More than 1 million Vietnamese are followers of this sect. Most of them live in the western part of South Vietnam. Islamic followers in Vietnam are primarily from the Cham ethnic minority group living in the central part of the Central Coast. The number of Islamic followers in Vietnam totals more than 50,000.
Now, we'll talk a little bit about your research on the history of religions here in Vietnam. Can you tell us a little bit about your research and what were some of the findings?
The situation here is the Vietnamese people are very tolerant and very gracious and very hospitable. It's a part of the culture. And that people of faith will be good citizens and they'll serve their local communities and people who don't have as much. And that this is good for the people of faith, but also good for the larger society because they're working for the common good.
And now, in terms of the characteristics of religion here in Vietnam, throughout your research of the situation here in Vietnam, what did you find most interesting?
Great question. You must do this on a regular basis. The most interesting piece, I think it was working so much with government officials and finding that they were very receptive to this strategic change of direction. And then working with them to implement that down to the lower levels, because sometimes that's what happens is there's problems at the local level and there's some authorities who don't want to implement the laws that the Prime Minister has put forward. And to see that from the top level gave me confidence and provided me with the integrity to work back in the United States and say there are real leaders here who want real change because it's in the best interest of their people.
Now, we talked about your study and your research on Vietnam. You've also visited the country 8 times. So throughout your visits to the different parts of Vietnam, what were some of the, what is your general view on the overall situation here in Vietnam? You mentioned 2006, is that right? You went to Gia Lai, and that was like right before your testimony.
Yeah, 2005 to Dak Lak and Gia Lai, and then we've had the great opportunity to visit there again, but we've been to the Northwest Highlands 2 times since then, and then to Dien Bien in March. And so the overall situation is that there is not systematic religious freedom violations going on, as some people would suggest, usually people that have not been here. And if I can add one thing, every place that I've ever asked to go, even the most sensitive places where there have been the most difficult issues reported on in the West, I've always been given free access.
In June 2004, the National Assembly of Vietnam promulgated the Ordinance on Belief and Religions. What would you say about Vietnam's effort in general towards the law on religious freedom? What do you think are some of the obstacles to that end?
Great question again. The evolution started with the Communist Party in 2003. And then that led to the ordinances that you just referenced in the fall. And then in February 1st, there was special instructions of 2005, special instructions on Protestantism. And then March 1st, 2005 was the Decree 92 for additional guidelines. So you've seen some serious and significant movement during those 2003 to 2005. And now there's been a process where the government authorities have been watching that and trying to understand what corrections should be made. But we need to move, and as I understand and as I listen to Vietnamese leaders, there's still the progression toward a transparent rule of law where everybody is held equal before the law. And that is where I think the National Assembly is going, and we want to be of support and help in any which way we can.
Things are improving quite considerably. It's better now than it was 20 years ago by far, and we're very pleased to see the progress that's being made. That's very commendable.
Có một sự thay đổi rất lớn ở tại Việt Nam trong so với 5 năm trước đây. Kể từ khi chỉ thị 01 của Thủ tướng Chính phủ ra đời, thì một số địa phương chúng tôi bắt đầu được đăng ký để sinh hoạt ở tại gia đình.
Trước năm 85 thì ở cái khu vực phía Bắc thì chúng tôi chỉ có những hội thánh thuộc về của người sắc tộc là người Dao. Nhưng mà cho tới nay thì đã có nhiều sắc tộc là những đồng bào đã theo đạo Tin Lành, và đặc biệt là đồng bào dân tộc Hờ Mông thì đã trở lại theo Tin Lành khá là đông. Mà theo con số mà đã tham gia đăng ký vào Tổng hội Hội Thánh Tin Lành Việt Nam miền Bắc của chúng tôi thì hiện nay thì có trên 200.000 tín hữu thuộc các sắc tộc ở miền núi phía Bắc.
The biggest progress is the recognition by the government and by party officials that religious communities are able to contribute significantly to the overall development of the people and of the country. I am not a critique of the political system in Vietnam, but I think many years ago, a generation ago, there were some officials that held the view that religion has nothing to contribute to society, to the development of the human person. But I think now there is a recognition that not only Christianity but other religious faiths can contribute significantly to the development of the people.
I am particularly struck in Vietnam by the importance here that people have shown of forgiveness, and I am very grateful for that, because I am very well aware of the horrific losses of life that have occurred in this country, and many Americans are very, very conscious of that, and we appreciate forgiveness, which is in fact a religious attribute in Christianity, Buddhism, and in most religions.
What would you say to opinions that say countries in the CPC list designated as countries of particular concern are usually countries with religions other than Christianity?
Are there other countries where, well, here's an example, Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is a Muslim majority country, and they're on the list because of how they treat their fellow Muslims. So it doesn't have to be just Christians. The origin of the act was from Christians and Jews wanting to take religious freedom seriously, because that's fundamental to how we were founded as a nation. It's a part of our DNA. It doesn't matter whether we're Republican or Democrat. But sometimes there's a perception abroad that the act was set up and the law was set up only to look out for Christians overseas. And while Christians are looked out for, obviously, all faiths are looked out for and all faiths are reported on, and none. Wherever religious freedom is being violated, that country will show up on a list, irrespective of the faith group that's being persecuted or harassed.
In the PC list, there are accusations that the countries which are put on this list are usually countries with different political regime than, say, the West. Say the People's Republic of China, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Vietnam.
Sure.
And there are accusations that say this means that perhaps the CPC list is politically driven. So what would you say to such accusations?
I don't think so. I had a conversation today with a Vietnamese leader that said, we are a spiritual nation. Vietnamese leaders have said to me, we believe in the individual dignity of human beings. Christians in America, that's the majority culture in our country, we believe humans are made in the image of God, and therefore that's where their inherent dignity comes from. So it's not a Western thing. Christianity started in the Middle East. It is a biblical thing for us. And that is the beginning of human rights for the majority of Christians in America. And I found those same values, the dignity of the individual, to be in other religions, Buddhist, Confucianism, and Islam. So I don't think it's an American thing or a Western thing. I think it's a spiritual thing that is reinforced by what we're trying to do in America and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Mm-hmm. The most recent report from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom once again recommended Vietnam be put into the CPC list. Now it's going to have to, I think, await the decision from the U.S. State Department as well. But if it is going to happen, are you going to testify again?
If I'm asked. You know, there's politics about who... Sometimes you watch congressional testimonies and you think it's a fair and balanced presentation, but there's a whole war that goes on to get who gets asked to testify. You might notice I haven't been asked to testify since 2007 because I try to take a balanced view and say there's actually many good things going on in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So if asked, I would testify, and I would testify that this is not the appropriate action to take at this time because of the positive things, and I would encourage congressional members to come to Vietnam with me and go anywhere they want to go in the country because they'll have the same access that I do, and we can have honest conversations with national and local authorities.
There are other opinions as well, saying that putting Vietnam into the CPC list, it's perhaps just a bargaining chip in the relationship between Vietnam and the United States. What would you say to that?
I understand how that perception could come. The reality is simply this. There are some serious incidences in Vietnam. They have been handled poorly by local officials, and they are the ones that get reported most. The media is not going to report 100 days of good news, as a friend of mine said today. They're going to report the one bad day, and that one bad day is going to stop the 100 days of good news. I used to play defense on soccer. Nobody ever encouraged me, but when I screwed up and they scored a goal, I sure knew about it. So that's the way that people think about these things, and you get 3 or 4 incidences, and then that forms this new impression. Mm-hmm. Oh, they're back to their old ways. Well, actually, it's 4 situations that were handled poorly, and now we have to do something about it, and we're going to ignore everything else positive that's going on. And our job is to make sure the positive is mentioned, and to make sure we have honest discussions about the issues of harassment.
And it's like a whole blank canvas with one slash of paint on it, and everyone obviously noticed the black mark and not the whole white canvas. And now back to your trip, this time to Vietnam. We know that the Institute of Global Engagement, IGE, in partnership with the Vietnamese Academy of Social Sciences, has conducted a Protestant roundtable in anticipation of the 100th anniversary of Protestantism in Vietnam. So we'll have a look at some footages from that event.